August 12, 1944. 14:20 hours. Base Hospital, Guam. Private Hiroshi Nakamura drifted back to consciousness expecting darkness. The machine gun burst that had torn through his squad on the beach should have been his ending. Quick, clean, honorable. Instead, white light filtered through what looked like canvas walls. His shoulder throbbed with a pain that suggested he was still breathing. A shadow moved beside his cot. Nakamura tensed, preparing for interrogation or worse. Then a cool hand touched his forehead, and a woman's voice spoke softly in English he couldn't understand. When he opened his eyes fully, he saw something that violated every assumption about captivity. An American nurse adjusting his blanket with the same care she might show her own brother. "Take it easy, soldier," she said in broken Japanese, offering him water from a metal cup. "You're safe now." For the Japanese POWs raised on propaganda about American brutality, the greatest psychological weapon turned out to be kindness, especially from enemy women who treated them not as monsters, but as wounded human beings deserving of compassion. The cultural earthquake. Japanese military culture had prepared soldiers for many forms of defeat, but not for mercy from female enemies. The presence of women in combat zones contradicted fundamental assumptions about gender roles, while their professional competence challenged beliefs about Western weakness and moral corruption. Nakamura had never spoken to a foreign woman before his capture. His village upbringing and military training had reinforced traditional hierarchies where women remained subordinate and separate from martial affairs. The concept of female military personnel providing medical care to enemy soldiers existed outside his entire framework for understanding the world. The nurse, checking his pulse, wore lieutenant's bars and moved with authority that commanded respect from male personnel. She made medical decisions, gave orders to subordinates, and handled responsibilities that Japanese culture reserved exclusively for men. Her competence was undeniable, but her very existence challenged everything Nakamura had been taught about proper social organization. When she returned that evening to check his bandages, Nakamura tried to refuse her care. Honor demanded that he reject help from the enemy, particularly from a woman whose presence in a military hospital seemed to violate natural law. But his wounds required attention, and her skilled hands worked with confidence that made resistance seem foolish rather than principled. The healing compound. The American hospital on Guam operated according to protocols that shocked Japanese prisoners more than the battles that had brought them there. Enemy wounded received the same medical care as American casualties, not as propaganda gestures, but as standard procedure governed by Geneva Convention requirements and professional medical ethics. Lieutenant Mary Collins had trained at Johns Hopkins before joining the Army Nurse Corps. Her ward contained 40 beds housing Americans, Japanese, and Korean laborers with wounds ranging from minor shrapnel damage to traumatic amputations. She moved between patients without regard for nationality, applying the same clinical standards to enemy soldiers as to friendly casualties. "A patient is a patient," she explained to newly arrived nurses. "These men aren't soldiers anymore. They're human beings who need medical care." Politics stops at the hospital door. The practical application of this philosophy created daily encounters that challenged Japanese prisoners' understanding of American character. Nurses administered morphine to enemy soldiers experiencing pain, changed dressings on infected wounds regardless of the patient's nationality, and provided meals that met dietary requirements rather than minimum subsistence levels. For men raised on stories of American barbarism, the systematic kindness was more disorienting than cruelty would have been. They had prepared for torture, humiliation, and death, but not for professional medical care administered with genuine concern for their welfare. The language of care communication barriers created intimate moments that transcended cultural differences. Japanese prisoners who spoke no English learned to interpret kindness through gestures, tone of voice, and the gentle handling of medical procedures. Nurse Helen Baker carried a small notebook containing basic Japanese phrases phonetically spelled in English. Itai desu ka? Does it hurt? Mizu? Water? Daijobu desu? It's okay. Her pronunciation was terrible, but the effort to communicate in patients' native language conveyed respect that formal interpreters couldn't match. When Corporal Kenji Tanaka developed a fever from infected shrapnel wounds, Baker sat beside his cot through the night, applying cool cloths to his forehead and monitoring his temperature. She couldn't speak his language, but her presence communicated care that needed no translation. She stayed, Tanaka wrote years later. An enemy woman sat with me in darkness while I burned with fever. Her touch was gentle, like my mother's hand when I was sick as a child. I couldn't understand why she would care whether I lived or died. The physical intimacy required for medical care created bonds that overcame propaganda conditioning. When nurses helped prisoners bathe, administered injections, or assisted with basic bodily functions, the human contact challenged dehumanizing stereotypes on both sides. The officer's dilemma. Japanese officers faced particular psychological challenges when receiving care from American women. Their military training emphasized hierarchy and honor codes that made accepting help from female enemies almost impossible to process within traditional frameworks. Captain Yoshiaki Sato had commanded an infantry company through 3 years of Pacific fighting before shrapnel from an American mortar round shattered his left leg. The surgeons had saved the limb, but rehabilitation required weeks of physical therapy administered primarily by female personnel. I could not look at them directly, Sato recalled in post-war interviews. These women held rank in their military. Some were officers like myself. They gave orders to male subordinates and made decisions about my treatment. Everything I had been taught said this was impossible, yet I witnessed it daily. The role reversal was complete and psychologically devastating. Sato found himself dependent on enemy women for basic functions like walking and personal hygiene. The nurses treated his military rank with courteous indifference, acknowledging his status while making clear that medical authority superseded military hierarchy. When Nurse Lieutenant Patricia Wong taught him exercises to rebuild strength in his injured leg, Sato experienced cultural vertigo that exceeded the physical challenge of rehabilitation. A woman was training him like a subordinate, and her expertise was obviously superior to his knowledge of medical procedures. The maternal touch. Many Japanese prisoners identified the nurse's care with maternal affection they remembered from childhood. The association created emotional responses that bypassed rational analysis and connected directly to fundamental human needs for comfort and security. Private Saburo Hayashi was 19 years old when captured, barely beyond adolescence despite 2 years of military service. The chest wound that had nearly killed him required daily dressing changes that involved intimate physical contact with medical personnel. Nurse Sarah Mitchell approached his care with the same gentle efficiency she used for all her patients, but Hayashi interpreted her touch through the lens of maternal love he had known before military service separated him from family. When she smoothed his blanket or adjusted his pillow, he remembered his mother's care during childhood illnesses. She hummed while working, Hayashi testified decades later. American songs I didn't recognize, but the melody was peaceful. It reminded me of my mother singing while she cooked. For a few minutes, I forgot I was a prisoner. I felt like a son being cared for by someone who wanted me to get well. The maternal association created cognitive dissonance that challenged basic assumptions about enemy character. How could American women demonstrate maternal instincts toward Japanese soldiers if Americans were the demons described in propaganda? The evidence of direct experience contradicted years of ideological conditioning. The professional standard American nurses operating in Pacific hospitals maintained professional standards that impressed Japanese prisoners familiar with their own military medical services. The systematic approach to patient care, the availability of medical supplies, and the competence of personnel created treatment environments that exceeded what many prisoners had experienced as free soldiers. The nursing techniques demonstrated training that emphasized patient comfort alongside clinical effectiveness. Pain management, wound care, and rehabilitation procedures reflected medical philosophy that viewed healing as a comprehensive process rather than minimum intervention to return soldiers to combat duty. Japanese prisoners observed American medical personnel working with resources and techniques that their own forces had never possessed. The casual availability of antibiotics, the routine use of blood transfusions, and the sophisticated surgical procedures revealed systematic investment in preserving human life that transcended immediate military necessity. The nurses themselves embodied American values that contradicted Japanese propaganda about democratic weakness and moral corruption. Their competence was undeniable, their dedication obvious, and their treatment of enemy patients revealed character that challenged fundamental assumptions about American society. The night shift revelations. The quiet hours of hospital night shifts created opportunities for personal interactions that revealed individual personalities behind professional roles. Japanese prisoners lying awake in darkened wards witnessed American nurses working with dedication that seemed to transcend duty requirements. During midnight rounds, nurses checked on patients with attention to detail that suggested genuine concern rather than routine obligation. They adjusted blankets, monitored breathing, and responded to needs that patients hadn't even articulated. The level of care suggested investment in patient welfare that exceeded professional requirements. Private Nakamura experienced insomnia from pain that prevented restful sleep. Night nurse Dorothy Fisher noticed his discomfort and spent extra time ensuring his positioning minimized pressure on injured areas. She brought additional pillows, adjusted lighting to reduce glare, and checked on him repeatedly throughout her shift. She didn't have to do any of that, Nakamura reflected years later. I was just another enemy prisoner taking up space in her hospital. But she treated me like I mattered, like my comfort was important. That kind of attention was something I'd never received from my own army's medical personnel. The personal attention created bonds that transcended political boundaries and challenged propaganda narratives about American character. These women weren't monsters or demons. They were individuals who chose to extend compassion to enemies who had been trying to kill their countrymen just days earlier. The cultural bridge. Some nurses made deliberate efforts to understand Japanese culture and incorporate cultural sensitivity into patient care. These gestures of respect created powerful psychological impacts that extended far beyond immediate medical benefits. Nurse Lieutenant Grace Yamamoto was a second-generation Japanese-American who spoke fluent Japanese and understood cultural nuances that other personnel missed. Her presence in American military hospitals shocked Japanese prisoners who had been told that Japanese people in America faced persecution and discrimination. When she spoke to patients in perfect Japanese and demonstrated familiarity with cultural practices, prisoners experienced cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions about American racism and Japanese identity. How could a Japanese woman serve as an officer in the American military if the propaganda about racial hatred was accurate? Yamamoto arranged for traditional Japanese foods when possible, understood the importance of certain cultural practices, and could communicate with patients about concerns that transcended medical issues. Her bicultural competence demonstrated American diversity and tolerance that contradicted propaganda narratives about ethnic persecution. She was completely Japanese and completely American, observed Captain Sato. Speaking our language perfectly, understanding our customs, but wearing an American uniform and serving their military with obvious loyalty. It forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about America's treatment of Japanese people. The letters. Home American nurses wrote letters to family and friends that revealed their perspectives on treating enemy patients. These personal accounts demonstrated humanity that extended beyond professional obligations and challenged them to examine their own prejudices and assumptions. Nurse Mary Collins wrote to her sister in Ohio, "These Japanese boys are so young, many barely 18 or 19. When they're unconscious from fever or pain medication, they cry out for their mothers in Japanese. It breaks your heart. They're somebody's sons, just like Tom and Billy. The war seems very far away when you're changing bandages and seeing how scared they are." The letters revealed internal struggles as American women reconciled professional duties with personal feelings about enemies who had killed American servicemen. Most found that direct contact with individual patients made hatred impossible to sustain, even when they had lost family members to Japanese military action. The correspondence also documented practical challenges of providing medical care across cultural barriers. Nurses described learning basic Japanese phrases, understanding dietary restrictions, and navigating cultural sensitivities that affected medical treatment. Their efforts to bridge cultural gaps revealed commitment to patient welfare that exceeded minimum professional requirements. The Rehabilitation Challenge, extended rehabilitation periods, created opportunities for deeper relationships between nurses and Japanese patients. The weeks or months required for recovery from serious injuries allowed time for cultural barriers to dissolve and individual personalities to emerge. Sergeant Ichiro Fujita required extensive physical therapy after losing his right arm to American artillery fire. The rehabilitation process involved daily sessions with occupational therapists who taught him to perform basic tasks with his remaining hand and to use prosthetic devices that might restore some functionality. Physical therapist. Lieutenant Barbara Chen worked with Fujita for 6 weeks, gradually building his confidence and capability through patient instruction and encouragement. The intimate nature of rehabilitation required trust that developed slowly but created genuine friendship between former enemies. "She never showed pity or impatience," Fujita recalled. "When I became frustrated with my limitations, she remained calm and encouraging. She taught me that losing an arm didn't mean losing dignity or usefulness. That lesson was more valuable than the medical treatment." The relationship that developed through rehabilitation challenged both participants to see beyond national identities to individual character. Chen learned about Japanese culture through conversations with Fujita, while he gained appreciation for American values through her patient dedication to his recovery. The medical innovation American military hospitals treating Japanese prisoners operated with medical technology and techniques that exceeded what prisoners had previously experienced. Surgical procedures, diagnostic equipment, and treatment protocols demonstrated systematic investment in medical advancement that impressed even skeptical observers. The routine use of blood transfusions, antibiotic medications, and sophisticated surgical techniques revealed medical capabilities that Japanese military medicine had never achieved. X-ray machines, laboratory testing, and specialized surgical instruments represented technological advancement that seemed almost magical to prisoners familiar with basic field medicine. Anesthesia availability for surgical procedures eliminated suffering that Japanese military medical services considered inevitable. Pain management during recovery used medications that made healing comfortable rather than enduring ordeal that tested patient character. The casual availability of advanced medical technology demonstrated American industrial capacity applied to humanitarian purposes. The investment in medical equipment and training reflected cultural values that prioritized life preservation over resource conservation. The departure anxiety, as Japanese prisoners recovered and faced repatriation, Many experienced anxiety about leaving American medical facilities where they had received care that exceeded anything they expected to find at home. The prospect of returning to war-devastated Japan created psychological distress that nurses helped patients process. The bonds formed during medical treatment made separation emotionally difficult for both patients and caregivers. Relationships that had developed over weeks or months of daily interaction created personal connections that transcended political boundaries and national identities. Many prisoners expressed gratitude that exceeded polite acknowledgement, revealing genuine affection for nurses who had provided not just medical care, but human compassion during their most vulnerable period. The emotional investment on both sides demonstrated that healing involved psychological as well as physical dimensions. Some prisoners requested permission to correspond with nurses after repatriation, hoping to maintain connections that had become important to their understanding of human relationships across cultural boundaries. These requests revealed the depth of personal bonds that medical care had created. The human recognition. The shock that Japanese prisoners experienced when receiving kind treatment from American nurses revealed the power of individual human contact to overcome propaganda conditioning and cultural barriers. Direct experience of compassion from supposed enemies challenged fundamental assumptions about character and nationality. The revelation that enemies could demonstrate genuine care for their welfare forced Japanese prisoners to reconsider everything they had been taught about American society and values. The evidence of their own experience contradicted years of indoctrination and opened minds to alternative understanding of international relations. In the quiet moments of hospital care, when pain medication eased suffering and clean bandages covered wounds, former enemies discovered their common humanity and planted seeds of understanding that would bloom into decades of peaceful cooperation. The nurses who chose compassion over vengeance proved that mercy could be the most decisive victory of all.